All right, so welcome everyone to another Green Reviews meeting. Thank you all for making the time to join, and also for all the discussions we've had offline, all asynchronously. It's yeah, let me share my screen with the notes as well. Or actually, would anyone like to volunteer to take notes today? I can host, but if someone would like to take notes, that would be really, really great.
I can do that.
Thank you, Antonio. Can everyone see my screen? Yep, awesome. Great. If everyone could also write their names in the list of attendees, that would be wonderful. We are in a meeting that is part of the CNCF, so we do follow the code of conduct. And I'm not sure if we have any new joiners that would like to say hi, unmute themselves, and maybe introduce who they are and what interests them about this project. That would be also really nice if anyone would like to do so. Who is new? Yeah, and a lot of familiar faces too, which is great to see. So let's get started. We have Melissa who has added talking points and updates. I would also like to hear there's some updates. Ross and Antonio, I know you've made some progress. Also, if you'd like to add some talking points to the agenda, that would be great as well. But let's just jump right in. Melissa, would you like to take it away?
Yes, of course. Okay, so as Nikki mentioned, there were a couple of offline discussions to clarify a few things offline. And the first one is that Falco will create the actual testing repo in their own organization, and the Green Reuse tooling repo will just fetch it. So that was one decision being made. And to discuss is what framework the projects should use. One option could be GitHub Actions and Ansible Kubernetes module, but it's still open discussion. And then we had an async discussion between Antonio, who is here, and two other Falco core maintainers regarding the synthetic workloads we will create to test Falco. For anyone joining new or who wasn't here the last time, Falco is a kernel security monitoring tool that runs in the background. So it's a little different than other applications. And to realistically test Falco, there needs to be some semi-realistic workloads running on the same knodes as Falco is running that produce syscalls in essence. And we discussed that the most realistic would be to use the microservices demo repo from the Google Cloud Platform organization. And if that doesn't produce enough system calls, we can add a little bit more stress using more traditional stress benchmarking frameworks. So we listed 3 options, and we can decide details later. There was also an open question in the design document regarding how we measure the kernel event rate or the syscalls being made. the kernel source tree itself maintains libbpf, and libbpf natively keeps track of some statistics. That is, the eBPF programs you load into the kernel that Falco does to do the kernel monitoring has like the stats has like counts, just like how often that eBPF program gets invoked. And the simplest way to derive kernel event rate would be to just keep track of the counts. Like one of the system call, either enter or exit event program, gets issued over time and then divided by the time Falco is running. And we can do this periodically and then derive some sort of averages and some guidelines or numbers I contributed was it should be at least 200,000 to 500,000 syscalls triggering per second. That would be something that could be considered more realistic for probably a lot of adopters. Okay, the next point. Yes, Nikki had a question about, in general, eBPF technology, and we created a dedicated issue in the Falco repo to answer any questions async and offline. And then I also added a couple of reference tickets. And yeah, happy to answer questions.
I had a question. So with the demo workload, I think it's great that we're going with the Google Cloud microservice demo. So we do want the demo workload to be on the same node as Falco. Do we, so I think the next step, right, is to make requests to the microservices demo workload. Is there any endpoints that you would recommend that you've used that is particularly good for creating events that work with Falco? That's also a question that came up last week on Thursday when we were looking at the demo, because we weren't sure which request, which endpoint would be the best to use.
If we could just shuffle as much on the same keynote as Falco is running, that probably would cause the most syscalls. But obviously, if there are DevOps limitations, as in from where we make requests against those microservices, that will work as well. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so kind of any that work depending on the DevOps limitations, if we need to create services or anything else to work with those services, for example, like at networking and how much work. So it doesn't, the question is, anything will work, but depends on the capacity we have. Okay.
At this point, I don't even know how much load those microservices will produce. Really, I couldn't even give a good guess if that's anywhere realistic or, yeah.
Yeah. There's some progress also from Ross with regards to the cluster configuration. So earlier this week, Christine and I paired to share API key with Ross, and so that's and with Antonio too, so that Ross can create cluster API setup with the Equinix infrastructure and have like a worker cluster there. Ross, would you like to give your update as well?
Yes, sure. So far I created a documentation PR for how to create the cluster manually using the Equinix cluster API provider. And I think it was yesterday or the day before, can I run that? And the steps weren't okay, so we have the cluster there. I've just got some problems with the SSH access. For some reason, I can't get into the nodes, but we can access the cluster through the config. So I think, yeah, apart from just that one issue, we have the cluster there. I installed Kepler just to verify that it was installed okay. That looks okay. So I think the next step that Antonio and I are going to work on is installing Falco and the microservices demo, and then we can start, trying things out. So this is the idea, which is to have a cluster there, so we can start trying things out. One thing I was wondering is whether it's worth just having a list of what are kind of the minimum kind of application we need to have installed, because we might need Prometheus as well at some stage. I know, but we've got a separate issue for kind of tracking what we're installing. So I think we can just keep that up to date as we kind of find new things we might need.
That sounds good. Yes, and Nandish, could you maybe add your link to the design doc somewhere so that we can track it for later in case we want to use that. That would be great. Awesome. So just to summarize what the next steps are. We are working on a dev environment for the Equinix infrastructure, and that's going well. Ross, for the SSH connection, I'm not sure. Is there anything that we can do to help with this issue?
No, I think it's okay. I'm just going to retry the steps again on my own kind of Equinix account and just see if I can see what went wrong there. At some point, we might need to rebuild the cluster, but I think we're still at quite an early stage, and that shouldn't be too disruptive, I don't think. Yeah, I think it is also possible to add like an SSH key through the Equinix console, but I'd like to see what went wrong with the steps just to figure out what happened there.
Okay. And then at some point, when you've deployed Kepler and the demo workload and Falco, we'll have to see, well, also Prometheus, yeah, and the list of everything that we need to add to the environment. Right, we did discuss at one point last week's meeting on Thursday to use Flux potentially to have everything that will be all the applications that will be added to a cluster defined in a repo. So I think that would be really great if you'd already like to start to track the applications that way.
Yes, yeah, I can start planning for that, and I think that would be great if we can have it in Flux, and then I think we can start using kind of GitHub's approach for everything that we run inside the cluster. I think that would just make things easier to work with.
Yeah, I can help with that. I've was full disclosure at Weaveworks before, so I'm happy to pair that with you anytime.
That'd be great, and particularly if you've got kind of a Git layout you kind of recommend that we can go with as well.
Yeah,
kind of pairing that would be great.
Awesome. Yeah, when you're as soon as you're ready, let me know and we can sync on that. This is something that we should discuss. Sorry for jumping back and forth. Hope that's okay. But yeah, what are the next steps, Melissa, to unblock you and move things along?
Yes, I think the only open decision is the frameworks we're supposed to use to first deploy Falco as a daemon set and then I don't know, I'm still not clear if deploying the microservices is going to be on us or if the crane reviews are going to do that, if we only add like stress tests. So it's kind of a little unclear to me where the boundaries are between what is part of setting up the cluster versus how the projects deploy their own tool.
Wouldn't, like, if we think a little bit long term, like we have quite many tools that may have different needs to ensure that we kind of measure the meaningful load on those tools. And I would guess that maybe the approach with microservices project that we will use for Falco may not necessarily always be the correct choice for the other tools in the CNCF landscape. So maybe kind of providing the best like a blueprint of what to deploy and what to run the load tests against could be something that is more owned by the tool maintainers themselves, but it is not necessarily something that we need to just put on you now and in the first iteration while we are just starting out. But maybe like this should be something that is, I think, could be important to think about already now to make it clear, like in general, if this is something that would be more beneficial for the tool projects to own other than green reviews, because I think the tools are quite different in terms of what they need to provide us meaningful data. I don't know what you others think about that.
Yeah, it's a bit of a dilemma because you want clean benchmarks that are not being influenced too much by other tools. At the same time, real production environments, they would have a bunch of these CNCF projects running a bunch of microservices. So I probably don't have a good answer today either. What is the best to have some sort of minimum set of workloads running, and that's the crane reviewers group defines this is how our cluster works. That's what's always running on there. Plus then you can add additional workloads. But again, I'm not so sure right now. But Christina, to your point, to make the first step, I think it's totally fine if we just deploy it over our repo, and we can still change our minds later. That's also okay.
So to clarify, it would be so if we look at the responsibilities, the Falco deployment itself would be the Falco maintainer's responsibility. The demo workload, well, the demo workload itself, we're probably going to use for many other, like I can imagine it being useful for Flux as well. It's hard to say, and we can always, we're going to change this when we have the next project come along to test. Maybe we need to make like a table with two sides and who does what, I think.
Yep, I agree. I see your dilemma, Nikki. You're also thinking about, yeah, there should be something shared and it's useful for a lot of projects, but also Christina's point of that's probably not exactly all what the other projects need. Coming back to if those demos just don't produce enough syscalls to just simplify it, we will just add more stress using these stress benchmarking frameworks. And that probably isn't something that's useful for a lot of other projects.
On the other hand, like you had a good point, Melissa, regarding like probably we could provide like a simulation of a production environment, you could say, with one project that we will deploy like this microservices demo, for instance. And this is something we can like state that this is what we have. And then if there is something more that may come in as a request from some projects, from the other CNCF project later in the long run, then maybe we could collaborate and have it either as an alternative or something in addition to the microservices demo. But we could probably just have some kind of a simulation environment that we can use. And if that doesn't work for someone at some point, then we could maybe take it then.
Well, one thing that probably will be important is versioning, because if we use this testbed to say this release versus the other release and the whole testbeds and the workload changed, the numbers won't be meaningful at all. I mean, it's going to be impossible to keep it constant, just saying, but at least like a little bit that there's going to be different versions, and maybe sometimes it's also okay to deprecate some older testbed version, but just to keep track in your final report, for example, in the Falco projects, like between those two releases, it's okay to just say like, oh, we deprecate this testbed version and now we only use that one. So the numbers going forward for the testbed version number 1 are not available. But for meaningful results, I think you need at least the same sort of testbed for at least 2-3 releases. At least in general, like I've just like after I joined Falco, I just realized how much it always bites you if you don't do proper versioning. So we just keep adding more versioning of subcomponents and parts. That's yeah.
But I think like to keep it easier for the first round of setup, right? Like we could just deploy, like let the Falco team deploy Falco. We can deploy the microservices. Then we have some tests, and then like we can go iterative. Like then we sit again together and say, okay, we need some more stress. Then we do it, and then I think we can keep the part where we think more about the system and like how can we extend this for later maybe. So that we don't worry too much. Anyway, it's not something like that. If we do, it's lost or like we have any downside, we can always retake it in the future. It's not like we're building something in the wrong direction or so. So I would keep it simple and just go step by step.
Yeah, and I think we can make our first goal getting measurements for Falco when it's idle, and then we'll add the tests. But we need the full metrics pipeline first before we add any tests.
Yep, fully on board from my side, so officially signing up for it. And I have maybe another question for Ross, since we're going to keep track of what's being deployed. It would be coming back to the versioning. Very important for us to know what is running on that K-node in addition to our workloads and Falco, to just keep kind of like track. It's not going to be perfect, but just roughly.
Yes, yeah, I think using Flux and having kind of a GURPS approach that should help with with what's on the cluster. But yeah, we'll definitely bear that in mind as we're kind of working on the cluster part.
Do we have more questions, Nikki? For me, it sounds pretty clear that we would go ahead and create a repository. Now's the time if you wanted to have a certain name. Now's the time to let us know. And perhaps after KubeCon, we can start experimenting. Assuming that I mean, if the cluster is ready, of course.
Yeah, that sounds good.
I have a question. Do we already have a description on how this metric pipeline would look like? Is it Prometheus based? Like Melissa mentioned libbpf, which is running on Falco. Do we need to measure something else? Do we have a design doc for the metric pipeline, or do we have to write that?
I think that the only part that we have in mind, and I also really want to hear about libbpf, Melissa. The only thing that we did have in mind previously was adding Prometheus and Kepler to have, right, this reason to test Kepler and get energy metrics. But yeah, Melissa, I'm also new to libbpf, and is it integrated in Falco? How does it work?
I can try to re-explain it maybe better. The first explanation today wasn't too good. Still, it's like 8 a.m. for me. So if you look at the design doc at the very bottom, I added the options we have. I think it's the other one, the design document. Yep, perfect. Okay, so there's two options. We can either have Falco natively emit those metrics, or if you also want to have those metrics externally, there's a small CLI wrapper called BPF tool, and it's a simple command line. You see here an example command, and you could get the same metrics. And the way it's integrated in Falco, since, I mean, we're making a lot of BPF syscalls anyways to load our BPF program, so it's just another call we just make periodically. We have Prometheus options to define the interval, 15 minutes, 10 minutes, 1 hour. And then we just do a snapshot and get those metrics back for our trace points. And I would say probably the Falco native implementation is a little bit more robust and better, because since we load the programs, we directly have the correct file descriptor, and we also know the name of the program. So there's never ever going to be any collision because it's the true file descriptor. And again, those metrics you get back, it's the number of times that eBPF program was invoked and the nanoseconds of time you spent within these eBPF programs. And all we need here is just the number of invocations. And we don't even need this for all the programs, Falco uploads. We can just pick one, either the system call enter raw trace point we use or the system call exit raw trace point we use. They're kind of like the same because every syscall has enter and exit event, so it doesn't matter. And Antonia, maybe to answer or add a little bit more to your question, for initial testing, we will have all the metrics, like Falco natively measures even the CPU memory usage, libbpf, and some internal counters of how many events are being processed, and except for the Kepler metrics, we don't do this.
So it's like there's two separate metrics pipeline for different reasons, of course. One is the kernel event rate to make sure that Falco is, to measure the frequency and intensity of Falco's usage. And I think this might fall under the responsibilities that, as we were discussing earlier, maybe that could be the Falco maintainers, like the project specific configuration. And then on the other hand, the working group's infrastructure will be maintaining specific tools, such as Kepler, for measuring the energy consumption, which we will be using for all CNCF projects.
I do agree. So I don't think there's any need to put this one on you. But just for the records, I just wanted to give you the option. If you wanted to measure or verify it externally, you could use that BPF tool wrapper. So you're not dependent on only Falco internally can fetch those metrics. And there's one setting that needs to be set in the kernel, and it's the BPF stats enabled. But since we're going to deploy over a privileged daemon set, we can also do it in our deployment. Just quickly set that flag.
One question, does also Falco export to Prometheus natively, or do we have to handle that part?
We don't do this. Contributions are welcome because it's a request by the community. Right now, there's two options. It's emitted as a internal Falco alert rule, or we can also pipe it to a file, and then we could just copy out that file for initial testing. There's an open ticket. People want it to be integrated with Prometheus.
So like if we want to visualize everything in Grafana, we would need some extra work. We need to work with some files, right? Like at best, Falco provides some files with metrics.
Yeah, maybe at that point, it's, let's see what's less engineering work to have Falco support exporting to Prometheus. Maybe that's less engineering work.
There's also the possibility of making a Grafana plugin from Falco, which might, instead of skipping Prometheus as a data source, I think that could be an option. But yeah, that is more work.
From yet to be
one,
just sorry, just fine to just look at the bare numbers, do the averages, and I'm not sure if we need dashboards for the first version.
No, I think the dashboard would be to in the end for the dev stats page that we would like to publish to. But I don't think that we need the kernel events stats in that Grafana dashboard. I think Prometheus works. It would be just to verify in our pipeline that Falco is running at the intensity that we're aiming for. In terms of this rate, you mentioned, yeah, the different metrics available. How is there more information on like what we should be aiming for?
Those are just going to be global statistics as in any syscall. Unfortunately, we will not know. I don't know how many file opens we should add or are currently happening versus should we add more network related stuff. We will not have those insights with those metrics, unfortunately.
And for, I guess when we get there, we can start iterating and talk with you to see what you think. Like if we should add more, etc., based on your experience. I'm I don't know if, you know, I'll just ask this because I'm not sure, maybe it's unclear for others too. So we're aiming to have the Green Reviews tooling repository as the basis for the cluster configuration. We're also talking about using Flux to deploy things such as Kepler and Prometheus and potentially the demo workload, but it's the demo workload is a little bit unclear because it would be used by other projects, but it would be used in a specific way by Falco, so it's a little bit more unclear there. And then the Falco configuration would be provided by the maintainers in the repo that we were discussing just before. I'm wondering how we will deploy Falco and any testing that is added to the Falco repository on our infrastructure. Like, is that going to happen through the repository? I mean, we can probably like curl the configuration and do something like that, but I'm not sure. Does anyone have any ideas or suggestions?
One part I've been thinking about is how kind of GitHub Actions figures into the pipeline as well. Because one option could be we could have a self-hosted runner. There's an operator that GitHub have, I think, that will run in the cluster. That might be a way of triggering things. But yeah, that's one of the open questions I have on my side really is how the GitHub Actions part of the pipeline and the triggering will work.
And that would be preferably over your repo, or? But basically where the GitHub workflow pipelines defined, regardless of the configurations.
Yes, yeah, I think it would make sense for it to be in our repo. I think Christina as well, we talked a bit about this before, about having kind of a reusable workflow as well, about how we can actually trigger it from maybe the Falco repo, but the actions config would be in the tooling repo. I think that part we still need to explore a bit more and work out how the design will work for that part. Nikki, what were you thinking? Oh, sorry, on scheduling the actual test run.
The action, so runners would run as, I think, would they run as pods in our node? I'm not sure.
Yes, I looked at it a little bit, and I think, yeah, it creates a pod with the steps of the action. So then that pod will be running, in the Equinix cluster. So that will be a way of initiating things.
Those aren't those jobs that created to begin with, and then those spin up pods. If you're talking about like how you would, are you talking about self-hosted runners that would run actions on the cluster, right?
Yes, yeah, the self-hosted run. Yeah, I wasn't sure. Yeah, there's probably a job that's actually controlling that pod.
Yeah, because I have done this previously in the projects where we used that and used Kubernetes clusters to run our GitHub workflows, and typically that's just jobs that spin up pods to run the necessary actions.
So are you envisioning like a job that, so we're hosting the actions runner in a cluster, it shows up as a pod, and there's going to be some steps. Maybe those steps could be in the Falco repository, and maybe those steps are, since they are in the repository, they have access to all the configuration, that all the manifests that have been written for how to deploy Falco and any other testing. And so that's how it would run the test and like deploy anything that is project specific to Falco. Is that okay? It's a good summary.
Sounds
Yes,
good to me.
That is a good idea. I would suggest maybe we can write it out and then in the design doc, and then we can iterate over it. It's a good idea. I'm wondering if anyone has any other ideas, any other proposals before we go in that direction.
Maybe just one comment, Nikki, if you could outline how many people would be available for PR review to trigger the pipelines, just a little bit the organizational aspect around it, just so that projects aren't stuck because one person's on vacation for 2 weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a discussion that we're having, that TAG leads also are having. We want to create new roles, and we want to expand also on the ownership of individual contributors and recognize also people's work and efforts in this. So we're looking at creating new roles with more permissions, like access to the API key, access to, like merge access as maintainers. We do also want to create new roles around tech leads and potentially have more co-chairs. So that is also an open call to everyone. So thank you for bringing that up, that we are trying to be more sustainable with the leadership and the of the working group, but also with the access and the ownership as well. It does take time to, decide on those, how we're going to, what the roles are going to be like, etc. And we have to create a process around it, but we're actively working on it. And Leo is also, driving this. So with that said, it is a priority. It's personally for me, it's what I'm prioritizing. So there's also the question of like chair and co-chair roles have more of like a organizational kind of responsibility, whereas a tech leader maintainer would be more hands-on with PRs and maintaining the infrastructure. So it's also a matter of like who's interested in doing one versus the other, and how do we organize ourselves. So if anyone feels would like to suggest things, feel free to reach out. Yeah, I'll let you know probably more on Slack once we know more, because we were having this discussion literally yesterday and the day before, so I haven't had time to follow up, but it's in the pipeline. No pun intended, but it is. We're working on it.
And maybe another, I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment for Russ, perhaps at the beginning, since Falco is the first project and we're still venturing out what the right configuration could be. Perhaps the GitHub workflow could be some sort of cron job that just tries to fetch the latest configuration, just to remove the dependency and overhead on your repo to refresh or redeploy or trigger. It could be an option to have faster test development cycles, or any other alternative approach that.
Yes, I think that'd be good, and I think we can do kind of to move step by step, because I think we'll kind of learn more about the pipeline as we work through it. But yeah, having something that to not put too much on us to have the kind of the tooling repo become a bottleneck. I think yes, it's good to explore that.
I think, Nikita, one open question was frameworks. And I think, Christina, you mentioned it would be better to have some sort of top-down definitions, to not have people come with their 20 different favorite frameworks. That could be a lot of overhead for you guys.
Yeah, I guess we need to decide on something now that we are starting out. Otherwise, it would be difficult if we will open. I think like this is kind of the stage where these suggestions make a lot of sense to come with while we are deciding, making these decisions on the tools and frameworks we're going to use. I guess now is the best time to do that. But this is something that also makes sense to discuss in this group. I think I would guess that having a top-down approach would make it a bit maybe easier, like once we come from our side as a group and say that this is the standardized way we would like this to work, and this is the framework that has worked well, and this is the framework that has also worked well, for example, with Falco. Then it kind of is also predictable for the other projects, and I guess would be a little bit easier to maintain instead of if we would open up for many different frameworks, at least while we are in the beginning. That's at least what I feel could be sustainable.
I guess maybe Russ, is it something you want to take on or decide? Or I mean, it probably should be treated differently from how to maintain the cluster itself.
Yes, I would see if we could kind of separate that out, because also I'm not sure how much kind of bandwidth I would have to, to look at that as well. I think having maybe splitting the kind of management of the cluster from the pipeline design would be good. But also having kind of a recommendation of something we kind of recommend, and then people have a starting point as well there. But yeah, I think that choice of framework, I think it would be good to have that as a separate discussion.
Just popping an idea in, what would you think about something as simple as a single file with all the Kubernetes resources in it? So like a bit the way, I don't know, some of the documentation gets you started. So like a single file with everything you need to deploy, and then you only execute one command, apply the file, and then I have all the configuration with all the values somewhere, and that would be also like simple and not too much of a work. I think as a downside, it's not too organized. So I think versioning would be difficult, and maybe customization of different scenario would also be difficult. From the logic of the pipeline perspective, would be quite easy to get started.
I think, Antonio, for example, Ansible would accomplish just that in a little bit more organized way. I'm just throwing it out here because we used it successfully in a different context to test different aspects of Falco, and I was not the person who set it up, but it has been working very reliably. Basically, they call it Ansible runbooks, where you define.
I think this would make sense if we go with runners, the custom runners, self-hosted runners, since that would be deployed and maintained in the repo that your team is maintaining, right? So that would make sense. And I'm for that idea. I would say maybe we should sketch out the self-hosted runners a little bit more, just to make that link, just to make that connection of how exactly Ansible would work in the whole part of that pipeline.
Yes, I think Actions and Ansible together could work well together, but I just don't have a lot of Ansible experience. So I think in my case, I wouldn't be the best person to judge what would be the best option there. But I think that around the self-hosted runners, that part, or in how we trigger the runs, is important. Maybe we can create another issue for that, and then work on the design doc and figure out, how we can actually trigger the test runs.
Maybe this is something I can help with, and then look into further. I don't have much experience with Ansible, but I have been working with self-hosted runners, so that would be a good opportunity to get to know Ansible a bit more. So if someone would like to pair or something, that would be nice.
We could also use an approach. We can say until, let's put a date. People can suggest alternatives or any frameworks, and then we pick the first one that we think likely works the best, and we try it. If it works, like, that's good. If not, we need to pivot. Or at least it's always good to have a document where you have alternatives considered, basically, when you make a choice for something, and not just go for something because that's the one thing you knew or someone recommended and you haven't even looked at alternatives. So it would be good to have at least like 1, 2, 3 things that we say we could use it, but we just decided to first try this option.
Yeah, so like Nikki mentioned, it would be good to start, first of all, to outline this in the doc and get some input there. That's probably an action item for us, I guess, to follow up.
I was gonna ask.
Yeah, I guess that's an action item for the working group to.
Yeah. I'm wondering though if how much we need to decide on a single framework if we are giving, like, we're asking people, okay, well, you can use this self-hosted runner in the repo that you are creating that fits your configuration in your project, that is unique to your project. And we are providing the infrastructure. We are making sure, that there's isolation for the project, where the project is run, and that Kepler is on it, and etc. But in this scenario, I feel like maybe the framework is okay to be different according to each project. But yeah.
Agreed. Yeah.
Would you like Melissa to write maybe like a paragraph on the Ansible framework in the design doc, and how I think it would just be like a few sentences, because you've shared the playbooks before, but just to have them under, yeah.
Yes, I'll try to reach out to those 2 or 3 people who actually set it up and had the hands-on experience, because I work with some kind of like at my company with custom stuff, different stuff, so we don't use all open source things. So I'll ask directly the experts who set it up before in our project.
Okay. Sounds good. And then we do have some interest, I think, we might be reaching out to other projects soon just to gather interest. So we will hopefully in the next couple of months have maybe an idea of what the next project could be and what their how that would work. But we are a bit far from that, and I don't want to yeah, we're almost at time. I just wanted to say thank you all for all the work that you're putting into this project, and I think it's very exciting that we're going to be at a point where we have this design, we have the pipeline, we are gathering those metrics, and we are looking at the energy consumption of various CNCF projects, and just to make sure that we acknowledge that a lot of us also are working on this on our own time, and if there's at any point if it's stressful or anything, you can always reach out, just acknowledging that we are volunteer run. If it's overwhelming or anything, or if you'd like to ask a question or share the work, just please say so, and don't suffer in silence. And that's a call out I wanted to make, just to make sure we are sustainable ourselves with our own time and each other. Yeah, so I think with that we're kind of out of time, and so we'll continue the conversation on GitHub and on Slack, and yeah, thank you all for joining today, and talk soon.
Thanks, Nikki.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.